In the same year that the United States joined the Allies, the allied country of Russia went through a huge world-changing revolution. Even before the Great War began, the people of Russia were unhappy. Most Russians were peasants. They lived a difficult life. The noblemen of Russia had power to order them around. They didn't own the land they farmed. They had to labor for long hours, and they had just barely enough food to survive. Meanwhile, the royal family of the Romanovs were leading a very different life. Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children lived in a huge palace, surrounded by servants, with all the food they could eat. The palace had a great hall with golden marble columns and a floor so smooth and polished that servants who went into it had to wear special shoes so they wouldn't slip and fall. The children had warm bedrooms all to themselves and a large playroom with shelves and boxes of toys waited to entertain them. Nicholas II had 2 different libraries of his own, the Great Library and the Small Library. Many of his books were covered in handmade leather and had gold or silver locks attached to fasten the covers shut. The books cost more money than an entire village of Russian peasants could earn in a year. The Tsar paid 2 librarians just to look after his book collection. The wealth of the Romanovs compared to the miserable cold poverty of millions of their subjects angered many Russians. The Romanov family had also grown unpopular with the Russian people for another reason. They spent too much time with a strange, mystical, unpopular monk named Rasputin. Just look at him, he looks shady, doesn't he? The Romanovs had good reason for spending time with Rasputin. Nicholas and Alexander's only son, Aleksandr, had a disease called hemophilia. If you scratch or cut yourself, you'll bleed a little bit and then stop, because your blood clots and keeps any more blood from coming out. But Alexander's blood wouldn't clot. If he scratched himself, he bled and bled and bled. He could die from the tiniest of injuries. Many of the men in the royal Russian family had inherited this horrible disease. Nicholas and Alexandra were sick with worry for their son, and Rasputin claimed to have magical powers that could heal little Aleksandr. So Alexander's worried parents invited Rasputin to stay at the royal palace with their family. Even though he was a monk, Rasputin drank too much, spent too much time at wild parties, and lived for pleasure and money. The Russian people hated and feared him, and because the Tsar and his wife had never told anyone outside of the family about Alexander's illness, the Russians didn't understand why the royal family had welcomed the strange magician to the palace. Many whispered that Rasputin had put a spell on the Tsar. 3 Russian noblemen who had hated Rasputin finally decided to get rid of him. They invited him to dinner and gave him poisoned wine and poisoned candy. Oddly enough, the poison seemed to have no effect on him at all, so one of the 3 men shot Rasputin. That didn't kill him either. He got up and went outside. The noblemen followed him and shot him again. He still didn't die. Finally, they threw him into the river. This time, Rasputin sank and didn't come back up again.
This is ours.
That's
moment.
insane.
He started this. He can't just...
But even with Rasputin gone, Nicholas was still unpopular. He only made things worse when World War I began. Nicholas immediately brought the Russian army into the war. It was a huge army. In 1914, it had 6.5 million soldiers in it. But the army wasn't very well prepared. As a matter of fact, it had fewer than 5 million guns, which meant that almost 2 million Russian soldiers marched into battle with no weapons at all. They were supposed to grab the guns that other Russian soldiers dropped when they died and go on firing. At first, the Russian army was commanded by the Tsar's cousin, the Grand Duke Nikolai. But in the first year of fighting, 2 million Russian soldiers were killed. Millions more were cold and hungry, because it was so difficult to carry food across the wide, cold plains of Russia to the battlefront. After a year of this, Tsar Nicholas II booted his cousin, the Grand Duke, out of his position and took over command of the army himself. This was a big mistake. Nicholas didn't know how to command an army or how to plan strategy. As a commander-in-chief of the Russian army, he made disastrous decisions one after another. More and more Russian soldiers died on the battlefields of the Great War. With every death, Nicholas grew more hated. All of the Russia blamed him for the deaths of the Russian soldiers. At the same time, food had become scarcer and scarcer, not just at the front, but all across Russia. On March 8, 1917, a group of women and children waited all day in line for bread. Finally, they reached the head of the line and were told that the bread was all gone. The hungry peasants in line were furious. They began to chant, "We want bread," and down with the Tsar. Like the peasants in line, more and more Russians began to demand that Nicholas II give up his throne. Finally, Nicholas II realized that he had lost the loyalty of his people forever. He gave up his throne and took his family to live in one of their favorite homes. In place of the Tsar, a provincial government took over running Russia. The leader of the provincial government, a lawyer named Aleksandr Kerensky, knew how unpopular Nicholas II was, so he ordered the entire Romanov family taken far away into Siberia, so that mobs would not attack and kill them in their homes. Aleksandr Kerensky began to try and change Russia's laws so that the country could be a better place to live, but he refused to pull the Russian army out of the Great War. As a matter of fact, he ordered the army to begin new battles against the Central Powers. The soldiers in the Russian army were exhausted and angry. Almost 2 million of them simply left the army and started home. Many of these ex-soldiers took their weapons back to the Russia countryside, murdered rich landowners, and took over their land. Kerensky and the provincial government were helpless to stop the killing. It was time for a new government to take control of Russia. The group of leaders who seized control of Russia were called the Bolsheviks. The leader of the Bolshevik was a man named Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Lenin believed that the peasants had the right to take over the land owned by the wealthy, because the wealthy had so often earned their money by forcing the poor to work hard for very little reward. He wanted the land in Russia to be used by the whole nation, the whole community, not just the rich. Lenin's ideas were popular with the poor and also with the millions of working people in Russia. Now, with the poor and working people discontent not only with their lives but with the government's decisions to stay in World War I, Lenin had the chance to get more and more Russians on his side. On October 24, 1917, Lenin and his followers made their move. Over 25,000 angry peasants, workers, and soldiers stormed through the city of St. Petersburg, where the government of Russia had its offices. The workers flooded through the Winter Palace and took control of the government offices. Kerensky's followers were arrested, but Kerensky himself ran fast enough to get away. Now Lenin and the Bolsheviks were in charge. Lenin suggested renaming the Bolsheviks the Communist Party, the party working for the common good. The communists believed that Christianity was false and wrong, so they changed the names of the cities in Russia that were named after Christian saints, like St. Petersburg became Leningrad, and right away Lenin and the communists signed a peace treaty with Germany. Finally, Russia was out of the war. There were 2 problems left. One was that the Tsar Nicholas and his family were still alive and living in Russia. The second was the people of Russia were still very poor. Lenin dealt with the Tsar first, he ordered Nicholas II and his whole family imprisoned in a house in the city of Yekaterinburg, far to the west of Petrograd. Then he sent word to the Tsar's guards every member of the royal family had to die. Lenin didn't want any Romanovs left to claim that they had the right to rule over Russia. On July 17, 1918, in the dark of the night, guards ordered the Romanovs to get dressed and go to the basement. In the basement, 12 men shot the Romanovs to death. They took the bodies 12 miles away into the heart of a dark forest and buried them. The Romanov family, which had ruled Russia since 1613, was no more. Now Lenin and the Communist Party governed Russia. That's very dark. Lenin tried to tackle the problem of Russian poverty in a new way, to make sure that the rich people of Russia didn't own all the land while the poor people had none. The Communist Party decided that all of the land in the whole country would belong to the government. The government would allow people to use the land equally. Instead of individual Russians building businesses, making money, and perhaps forcing other Russians to work for the little pay, the government would own and run most of the businesses, not just the electric company and the water company, but hospitals, schools, grocery stores, bookstores, and even hot dog stands. This new way of living, communism, was supposed to make sure that the government, instead of a small group of powerful people, had control over Russia. But who was in the government? That's right, a small group of powerful people, Lenin and his followers. So, let's review. Russia under the Romanovs, the peasants were poor and hungry. The Romanovs paid too much attention to the monk Rasputin. Many Russian soldiers were killed in World War I. And finally, the Russians demanded that Nicholas II leave his throne. And then the provincial government took over, army ordered to begin new battles, the soldiers left and went home, or they killed rich men for their land. And then Bolsheviks took over, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and he renamed the party the Communist Party. And he murdered the Romanovs, and now all the land belongs to the government. And the government is owned by a few powerful people. I don't think Russia is in a much better place now.
That's all. I shouldn't have had those artichoke poppers.